Welcome to another Pakistan.hundred podcast. I'm joined today by Dr. Kate Vyborny. Kate is the Associate Director of the DevLab at Duke, and she's also a postdoctoral associate there. She holds a DPhil or PhD in economics from the University of Oxford, where she was a Rhodes Scholar. And she's been working in Pakistan now for a decade or more, roughly a decade. Is that right, Kate?
Yeah, that's right.
All right. So welcome and thank you for doing this. So your work is relevant to one of my favorite topics when we're thinking about Pakistan's future, which is the lack of women's participation in our labor force. We have one of the lowest labor force participation rates, if not the lowest in the world, at about 21%. A recent ILO study indicates that if Pakistan were to reduce its gender gap in labor force participation by 25%, our GDP could increase by about 9%. So there's a lot of economic potential that we're not unlocking by virtue of not having women participate as actively in the labor force as they might do. You have a lot of work that looks at both women's labor force participation, also their their access to benefits in the BISP program, and their mobility, their ability to be transported from their homes to the workspace and back. Could you start by telling us a little bit about that work on transport, please?
Yeah, absolutely. One thing that we might want to share for the audience is that many people may be thinking, when they think about women not participating in the labor force, that women in this context just don't want to participate in the labor force, that there's a strong social norm against it, and that no matter what kind of constraints you remove, that they'll decide not to participate because they would have a preference, or their families would have a strong preference for them to be at home looking after kids or taking care of the home. And that may certainly be true for a lot of people, and clearly social norms have an important role to play. So there's this suggestion in the data of a latent female labor supply. So women who are out there would be interested in finding a job, but can't find something, or can't find something that they can access for a variety of reasons. So family permission is definitely one of those reasons, but there are a lot of other constraints occurring as well. And this project explores one specific constraint, which we think is important in many contexts, including in the urban environment.
I think it's important to underline that the cultural constraint we have is not necessarily a religious constraint. Many Muslim countries have far higher labor force participation than ours, right? So we're at 21%. Bangladesh, for example, is at 30.5%, and many other Muslim countries have more labor force participation. So you're absolutely right that there are cultural issues, but I think it's worth underlining that we can't just sort of throw up our hands and say, well, we're Muslim and we do things a different way. There's something particular about our culture, and this is something that is within our ability to engage with and perhaps try and shift over time. But anyway, I didn't want to interrupt the broader
No,
story.
I completely agree. I mean, I think we shouldn't just say, okay, well, there's the social norms and therefore there's nothing that can be done productively to enhance women's scope of choice. One other thing that I guess that we should add in this sort of more general discussion is that I think the assumption that's going on behind what we're trying to do in all of these projects, and I think the philosophy behind what you're saying as well, is not that all women should necessarily be working, but that women should have a choice about whether to work, and that it should not be a decision that's made for them, that we should be looking at expanding the set of opportunities. When we think about economic growth, one of the engines of that is urbanization, in which we see more coming together and more scope for specialization, in which individuals and firms start to work on more and more specialized tasks, and you have matching of workers to firms. That can only really happen if people can move around the city, and if people are not restricted to only working in their immediate neighborhood, which de facto may be the case for a lot of female workers who they're living in a huge city, But in fact, the labor market that they have access to might be very small. And the reason for that is a combination of lack of safety on the street and on public transport. So women fear violence and sexual violence, and also social norms that stigmatize women moving around in the public space without a male or solo, but without anybody accompanying them, or without a male accompanying them. And those two things really, we think, probably interact, because when there's a norm saying that a woman shouldn't be out by herself, that also encourages or might sort of legitimize harassment against a woman who is breaking that norm and moving around by herself. So this project is investigating the importance of that dual constraint of safety and norms on women's labor force participation in an urban environment in Lahore district.
How are you doing that?
So we're running an experiment as a part of a project with the Center for Economic Research in Pakistan and our research team at Duke. We have a job search service called Job Talash, in which we have thousands of female job seekers who are participating in the service. We also have over 1,000 firms that place ads on that same service. So the job seekers have registered and they've given their basic information, their CV or application information. The firms post ads saying, we're looking for a receptionist, or we're looking for a driver. They post all the different kinds of ads. And then we send the ads we use a call center and SMS based interaction to inform job seekers who qualify for those jobs that here's a job opportunity, would you like to apply for it? So that's going on a regular basis. And then on top of that, we have added an experiment in which we're offering transport to some of the seekers. So we have job seekers who just get information about a job. So there's a receptionist opportunity, which you might be qualified for in Gulberg at a certain firm. It pays this much, and do you want to apply for it? And then we have other job seekers who get the same information, but they also are told that there's a Job Talash pick and drop service that would take them safely from door to door to get from home to work and back on a daily basis. And they could subscribe to that at a certain rate on a monthly basis if they take up the job. And so what we find is that, so we do this, and then we see how that affects whether people apply to the job and whether they apply to, like, what happens after that. So right now we have results on their application rates. We're still collecting data on the outcomes beyond that. But at the application stage, we see results that are really dramatic. So when we offer this transport service to men, it doesn't change their behavior at all as far as application rates. They apply to jobs at the same rate as they were in the control group who don't get a transport offer. And that makes sense, given that most of the men told us at baseline that they have their own way of getting to work. A lot of them ride motorbikes, they're mobile. They're not concerned about this. When we offer women a transport, it increases their application rates dramatically. So the main treatment arm, in which the women are actually offered a women-only van in which there will only be women sitting, actually triples the application rate of women in the treatment group compared to the control group. They're applying at a much higher rate to jobs where that service is available. So the response seems to be driven by an offer of getting to work on a van that's only women from door to door, a completely safe, harassment-free, stigma-free way to get to work.
So couple of quick follow-ups to that. That seems like a pretty simple problem to solve, both by market players. So if you can imagine that if the labor force isn't unlocking this opportunity, either employers themselves or transport companies should be running women's only transport, or by the government. And I remember as a kid, I used to go to school on a public bus back in the day. Sometimes my mother used to ride around town on a public bus with us in tow, and these public buses used to have a portion, the first quarter or so, 1/3 of the bus was cordoned off for women, and there was like
Yep.
a metal door separating that from the men's section. That's a pretty simple technology to implement. There's nothing hard about it, and we have in fact done it in the past. It's much less common now, and it's certainly less common in private buses. Is this a regulatory problem, do you think? Is it there's less demand for it? What's your sense of why we're not solving this issue?
So you talked about the possibility for employers to solve it, and also I think for government to solve it through public transport, and that's something we've thought about both of these a lot. So I guess I would make a couple of observations. One is that what we found in sort of preliminary surveys that we did at the beginning of this project is that, and also in kind of qualitative work that complemented it, is that there's actually a lot of the concern that women have is part of it is about what transport planners call the last mile problem. They get harassed at bus stops, both physically and verbally, and they worry a lot about that. And so even a pretty high quality, I think high quality public transport is a bit important part of the public policy solution to this, but it cannot stand alone. Like, what it really needs to be complemented by a set of other things that need to happen at the neighborhood level. So that probably means a combination of things like more responsive and better quality kind of police presence that's more gender sensitive, and so forth. Because ultimately, it's probably not a scalable solution to have everyone dropped off and picked up at their door.
Sure.
For every trip that they need to go on, especially in a low-income society. The other thing you talked about employers and why don't employers do this already, and that's something we've thought about a lot. What we've observed is actually that in the employers who've signed up with our service, the majority of them don't have any female employees to start with, and but a lot of these firms actually that have only men or have have almost all men in their current workforce are willing to look at CVs from women. If mobility is a key constraint, a firm like that would never run a service like this by itself.
There might be 10 businesses on the same street that might viably run a small car or a van or something. But they might have coordination problems, literally free rider problems, other issues like this. So let's move from transport and just talk more generally about the type of barriers that women face in the workspace. You've also worked in other countries. And perhaps not so much in terms of research conclusions, but also just the sense that you've gotten from being in the field in Brazil and Saudi Arabia, other places. The few things that I can think of include childcare. And then also you talked about transport safety in the sense of being in a safe space, but also in the workspace. Like if these are men-only job environments that are hiring the first woman worker, that's a pretty intimidating situation to be in at times, right, for women.
Yes, definitely.
So what might be, and perhaps not just from your own research, but other work that you've seen. So first, perhaps tell us a little bit about what the challenges are, but then also some of the solutions that have been tried out here and elsewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. So I completely agree. The two that you mentioned, childcare and harassment, are very high on the list of important constraints. And those are both areas where we don't actually know as much as would like to in terms of what the extent of the barrier that they pose and also what's effective to address those constraints. So I think that the really childcare services in other contexts like the US are really regulated, and those are not perfect markets by any stretch of the imagination, but I think people have a fairly good degree of trust that the people who will be taking care of their children have a level of training and that they're following certain set of standards. I think part of the reason that you don't see much coverage of group-based childcare in a context like Pakistan is because of lack of trust in sort of enforceable regulation on childcare. So they are regulations on daycare provision, but they're in Pakistan, but I think they're generally not being followed much at all. And people feel, what I've observed is that people feel more comfortable with the idea of keeping the child at home with, say, a nanny who might be preferably overseen by an extended family member, as compared to putting them in a daycare center. There are some daycare centers, but I think they tend to really cater much more to the very high end, like the highest sort of income, part of the income distribution. One of the things that the government has been doing has been to look at infirm daycares, but that's only probably likely to be, given the norms about who does the caring in this society, that seems like it's only relevant for firms that have a lot of women already, and doesn't really help with firms that are just on the margin of whether to hire a woman or not. In fact, they might ultimately, if the regulation is too strong, they might ultimately create a chilling effect on hiring women as well. One of the disadvantages of pushing on a regulation like that is that you could discourage firms from hiring women. They wouldn't want to hire women if it means that you hit a certain number of women and now you have to provide a daycare, which could be an expensive thing for a small firm to do. So we have to tread carefully, I think, in terms of thinking about how does the regulation, when does it help and when does it actually have the opposite of the intended effect?
Sure, absolutely. So another thing that, I work on police reforms, and one of the things that I find is that the women's police is actually very, very small. So the number of officers that we have that are women is probably less than 5% or thereabouts, maybe 10%. I think it's less than 5%, but I'll have to check. And then, so there are lots of issues that women can't discuss with men or aren't comfortable discussing with men. There are spaces, perhaps women-only spaces, that only women obviously can go in police, and though that would sort of add to the lack of safety that women feel, perhaps. But we're not obviously the US. We're an environment that is both regulatory, in a regulatory sense, weak. We have a limited capacity to bring the state to, or state corrections to market failure. In closing, can you give me a few sort of thoughts on what are the things that we as a society and a government, what are maybe the top 2 or 3 things that we should be focusing on in order to not only make our labor force participation higher for women, but also just make Pakistani society a more wholesome, more comfortable place for women to interact in over the next 20, 30 years?
So I think that there are probably some areas where it's easier to make changes than others. And I think if you talked right at the beginning of the discussion about some other societies such as Bangladesh, which share many common aspects of heritage with Pakistan and yet have achieved more in some of these spheres. I think one thing that characterizes Bangladesh has been that's driven, sort of been a driver behind some of these changes, has been the presence of specific types of industries. In particular, in Bangladesh, is the garment industry, which I think a lot of research has shown has drawn in women and kind of increased female labor force participation. So even though this kind of industrial policy or focus on attracting certain kinds of industries is not my area of expertise, I think it's an interesting area to think about as a potential, something that can be a driver in terms of creating jobs that people see as suitable for women, or jobs in which employers look to a female labor force as being desirable for certain kinds of skills. So I think that is probably a part of that kind of strategy is probably a part of the solution. There's in the physical mobility space, I think there's, there has been an emphasis on high quality public transport, and I do think that should continue. I've also noticed that there's very recently several startups kind of operating in this space in a number of cities in Pakistan, which I'm following with a lot of interest to see how much they help Kareem obviously is Kareem and Uber since a few years ago, ride-hailing companies, and then some that are more affordable-based, sort of bus-based transport. So I think those have the potential to help with the mobility constraint. But I think there are some things ultimately that really only government can do, and it comes back to the point you were making about policing and making sure that that policing is effectively addressing issues of women's safety, because that is something that is never going to be done by a startup or the private sector. That's fundamentally a state function, and without that, it's difficult for many of these other things to move effectively. Even if the opportunities are out there, if people don't feel safe getting to them or in the workplace, then and they don't feel that they have any recourse, then it's hard to move forward. So yeah, I mean, I think that's a tough nut to crack, and that's your area of expertise, I think, more. And so would be keen to hear your thoughts about what can be done next in terms of public safety for women from the policing side.
I think the first thing, like I said earlier, is just recruiting more police officers that are women. So I have ongoing research that looks at what happens when you have women police officers listen to male police officers. I'm sorry, listen to women citizens to understand what the community's problems are. And it's very early to talk about results there because the research is still ongoing. But the expectation is certainly that naturally that women are typically more comfortable talking to women on all sorts of issues, especially when it comes to police officers. Male police officers can be pretty intimidating. Police officers in general are pretty intimidating, but male police officers more so perhaps for women and children. So first step would be to just hire more women officers. But certainly I think I do agree with the sense that looking at similar cultures like Bangladesh, Malaysia, Muslim countries that have greater women's participation, we need to start engaging in the conversation of why it is that other Muslim countries have more women in the workforce and we don't. And that's a national conversation that needs to begin. But certainly also the sort of things that you've talked about, even without that broader cultural discussion happening, I think there's a lot we can do to alleviate constraints such as transport, such as perhaps regulations at times and childcare issues, to alleviate constraints that might not get us from 20% to 40%, but might get us from 20% to 25%, and that's a really substantial win for the economy and society in its own right.
So I totally agree with everything you've said, and maybe this won't fit in the time, but I just wanted to add one other thought about this sort of big picture is that one extremely positive trend, which has been chugging along over years, is a big increase in the level of number of women who are completing higher education. So they're getting to bachelor's. A lot of those women they finish their studies and they don't go onto the workforce. Some of them do. But again, in our outreach for signing up women for these job search services as part of the study, we've seen that there's a lot of interest. Many women are interested in working after they finish, but they don't necessarily know how to take the next step. And so part of, I think, what we should be thinking about from the government point of view is how to think about job search and the employment-related programs that plug into that, which are not necessarily the same as the kind of traditional standard set of vocational training or job type programs. One thing we've seen is that a lot of those women who are finishing college or intermediate college or bachelor's have much of a social network, and most job search in fact happens through social networks, and so they don't have a professional network, especially if they're the first in their families or the first women in their families to go to higher education. And so plugging them into that so that they have mentors, so that they have a network to work from, is probably an important thing that could happen as well. And that's a study that we're looking at doing further studies in this area as a part of that broader Job Talash research program. So we'll hopefully share updates at a later date on anything we find in that space.
So you'd imagine, though, that online platforms like Job Talash and like Rosie.pk and so on would be in some sense substitutes for that social network that they might not have built up.
Yeah.
Anyway, so this is actually a fairly optimistic note on which to end. It's a pretty difficult problem. Again, as we said earlier, labor force participation in Pakistan is one of the worst in the world, and it seems like it's an own goal in the sense that there's a possibility, and we're not using half of our population effectively, but other countries are, and so I think it's important to push against this notion that Muslim women don't work, for example, because they do in other countries, right? And I think what you said about women being more educated suggests that the economic potential of women is rising. And in some sense, it is for us to integrate or to tap that economic potential in a way that doesn't create a cultural backlash either, in a way that's culturally our own, but does value and use that economic potential. And as you said, that might also have carry-on effects. We've done discussions in the past about how women who work and women who are educated create all sorts of further benefits for their families, for their children, and so on. So anyway, Kate, it's with the hope that in the next 20, 30 years, a lot of these problems will go away. That I think we bring this talk to a close. Thank you very much for being a part of it. I appreciate
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks. Take care.